Hello, everybody. It is August 8th, 2026, here in the United States of America. I hope everyone out there is having a fantastic day. I was actually supposed to be at Lake Erie today for a fishing trip, but due to the weather up north taking an unfortunate turn for the worse, the trip was canceled, and now I'm home for the day. So I figured since I'm home for the day, I would produce a little bit of content. And what I wanted to talk about today actually is Cuba and the overall geostrategic situation here in the Americas involving the United States and what I think is the US government's policy under President Trump of securing its sphere of influence here within North and South America. Now, the United States being one of the world's preeminent powers, it does have an obvious zone of influence, a sphere of influence, if you will. And traditionally, that has always been North, Central, and South America. The United States sees itself, if not the global hegemon, then at least the hegemon of North and South America. It is by far the most dominant economy in this part of the world. It has by far the largest military. It is a completely unassailable power in this region of the world with no powerful neighbors to speak of, no country that's hostile that has any force that could actually be of any consequence to the United States or any sort of real hindrance on their foreign policy. Now, everybody knows, I'm sure, that last year the Trump administration ordered a raid on Caracas, Venezuela, to capture the president of Venezuela, Nicolas Maduro. Now, Nicolas Maduro was an open critic of the United States of America's foreign policy, and his government was deemed to be hostile to the United States. Now, Venezuela's government was openly allied with the two countries that the United States would clearly see as its chief rivals, China being the second most powerful country in the world, and Russia being widely considered to be the third. Now, Russia and China had a history of supplying weapons and aid to aid the Venezuelan government, and it seemed to be an outpost. I don't want to say an outpost of hostility, but an outpost within the United States' sphere of influence that could potentially be a launching platform for hostile activities and against the United States in the event of a war, or could well, they actually controlled quite a bit of oil in this region of the world too, and that's a big part of it. The United States wants to control the resources within its sphere of influence. Now, I'm not advocating for any particular U.S. policy. This is just the reality of it. This is the reality of great power politics between the world's preeminent civilizations and preeminent powers. This is how things work. Large countries want to control the resources within their sphere of influence. They want the nations around them to either be neutralized or to be vassals. They don't want any hostile forces on their borders. And they want to make sure that they're surrounded by a nice, comfy buffer zone, and that countries around them can be, I don't want to say exploited because that's a bit of a harsh word, but the relationship with those countries needs to be of a benefit to the dominant power in the region. That's just how things work. Anyways, so Venezuela was neutralized by this raid. The government seems to have come around to having a good relationship with the United States. Me, along with quite a few other people, think that this was an inside job. Members of the Venezuelan government were under pressure from the United States, from the CIA, and essentially gave up Maduro with the arrangement that they would then hold power in Venezuela and do what the United States asked, so long as they could be the ones that run the country. I'm pretty sure that's how things went, because the Venezuelan government became much friendlier to the United States after Maduro was gone, despite the fact that many people that held key positions in the Maduro government are actually still in place, from what I understand. So that just leaves Cuba. It looks as if Cuba is now really the only country in the Americas that has a openly antagonistic relationship with the United States, and vice versa. This is, I would say, the last bastion of an old Cold War world order from the 80s here, left over in the Americas. Now, Cuba is of no real actual military threat to the United States. I think everyone could agree with that, but its government is openly antagonistic and hostile to the United States. Um, we could get into the historical reasons as to why. Cuba is considered a communist government. The United States is considered a capitalistic, democratic government. There are some, what's the word for it? Ideological issues there. From the American point of view, it doesn't want to tolerate an outpost of communism within its sphere of influence. Cuba has been there for far too long. It had been used in the past as a staging ground for possible nuclear weapons against the United States. This resulted in the Cuban Missile Crisis. The same government that existed back in the 60s is still there, just headed by different people. So I think because of the United States' policy of wanting to clean out the Americas, Cuba is now the last country standing that has or refuses to have any kind of positive relationship with the United States and vice versa. Under President Barack Obama, restrictions were lifted, not totally on Cuba, but they were lessened quite a bit. And then when the Trump administration came into power, I would say the neoconservatives within the administration quickly demanded that Cuba again be isolated and under extreme economic pressure, and travel be restricted to put pressure on the government to acquiesce to the United States' demands. And I think that's what we're seeing now. This is part of President Trump's policy here in the Americas. It's to completely secure the Americas and exert the United States' full influence and control over Canada, over Mexico, over Central and South America. There's quite a few resources here. The Panama Canal is right here. This is a key economic choke point the United States wants to always maintain control over. And yeah, so there's been some very interesting things being said by the State Department right here. I found this to be interesting. Cuba's assault on the United States was never at root a quarrel over economic policy or sovereignty or even ownership of a particular territory. It was a revolution against Western civilization itself. So Cuba, even in its much weakened state, very, very weakened compared to, I would say, what it was back when it had full support of the Soviet Union, it's still being painted as an imminent threat to the United States, as the central hub of communist activity here in the Americas. Now, to be realistic here, I don't think communist activity here in the United States ever really relied on Cuba for anything, and I don't think Cuba was its birthplace. Sure, Fidel Castro was seen as a very sympathetic figure by many on the American far left for quite some time. Same thing with Che Guevara. But as far as it being the focal point and the epicenter of communism or radical leftism here in the United States, I think that's a bit of a stretch. But the point is to make Cuba seem like a valid target in the eyes and minds of the American people. Things like this usually are said when when the government is testing the waters, I would say, to see if a military intervention would be something that could be stomached by the American populace. If this is something that the general population of the country would accept, there needs to be a reason for it. There needs to be something the American public can latch onto. Cuba is the epicenter of all these things we don't like. It's time to get rid of Cuba. Yada, yada, yada. You know where this is going. This is just how things are. Now, I'm not advocating for any specific policy here. This is just the reality that Cuba finds itself in. Now, I would say Cuba, like Venezuela, is at a pretty serious disadvantage here. They're not going to be supplied by Russia and China in the event of an invasion or a war. China is extremely far away, as you can see. And Russia, I would say, has its hands full in Eastern Europe right now. And also, too, Russia is very far away from Cuba itself. It's a very long flight to get here. Same thing with China. Aid could not come through the Panama Canal from China. I'm sure that would be blockaded by the United States in the event that military aid was sent to Cuba. Cuba has received some aid from Russia, I think, in terms of fuel, of oil, and whatnot. And the United States allowed that to go in. But as far as actual military support, I don't think the United States would allow for that. That's also why Venezuela didn't really get any help um, prior to the United States, um, prior to the raid on Caracas to capture Maduro, is because of geographic isolation. Any nation here within the Americas that's allied with Russia or China or another rival power of the United States is at a pretty serious geostrategic disadvantage. Aid cannot come easily. No matter where you're at in this hemisphere, you are very far away from China and Russia, unless you are, I would say, in Alaska and Canada, because Russia's right here. But other than that, your two main allies could not come to your rescue easily or quickly. So that kind of leaves whatever nations over here at the mercy of the United States, which is why I think, other than lip service, Russia and China really never lifted a finger to help Venezuela, because there was really no point to do it. Um, their hands were tied, and actually supplying and helping the Maduro government in any meaningful way just really wasn't feasible for them. So I think they resigned themselves to Venezuela falling under direct control and influence of the United States of America. I think that's going to happen to Cuba very soon. I think this economic blockade eventually is going to cause Cuba to break. And if it doesn't, based on what the State Department is now saying, I would say that some kind of raid on Havana to capture key government officials is likely. And also, given the state of Cuba and what happened in Venezuela, I would not be surprised if high-ranking officials in the government sold out their own leadership to make a deal with the United States to relieve economic pressure against Cuba. And Cuba has really no military to speak of to actually resist any kind of offensive action by the United States. So Cuba finds itself in a very tough position, or the Cuban government does. I don't think they'll hold out for much longer. And eventually, I think the pressure is going to break the Cuban government, and Cuba, like Venezuela, will probably fall under the direct sphere of influence of the United States. But this is how things like this work. The world's preeminent powers will always aggressively pursue interests within their sphere of influence. Smaller nations, if not allied with these larger countries, will find themselves eventually under the thumb of that major regional power. What's happening in the Americas is no different than what would happen in Central and Eastern Europe with the Russian Federation, or Southeast Asia with China. These countries will always look to control the nations within their sphere of influence for their own security interests. And the United States is, I think, attempting to turn North and Central and South America into its own personal, well, I don't want to say playground, but this is I would say, geostrategic fortress. If every country here has a positive relationship with the United States, or is an outright vassal of it, well, then the United States can greatly limit the influence of its rival powers within what it sees as a sphere of influence. But I would say the one country, though, in South America that has the means to not completely fall under the thumb of the United States is Brazil. It's a very large country. It's got a large military. It's part of BRICS. I think Brazil, for its own sake, is probably going to try to have a positive relationship with the United States as much as it can, to try to put itself in a neutral position where it's friendly enough with the United States to not seem like a direct threat to the U.S. But I would say, if Brazil ever made any kind of defense alliance with Russia and China, or really started to move in the direction of some kind of formal alliance with what countries the United States sees as its chief rival powers, well, then I think things would change, and the United States would have a much more hostile policy in regard to Brazil. And I think the Brazilian leadership, regardless of who is in there, even the new government, which is more of a leftist progressive government than the last one, I think is still trying to play geopolitics as smart as it can, knowing what sphere of influence it lies in, and knowing that their options to keep the United States off of their back is fairly limited, despite Brazil being a fairly formidable regional power in its own right. But anyways, that's all I wanted to talk about in this video. As always, if you enjoy this content, please consider subscribing to the channel. Drop me a like. If you have any other points that you would like to make, or anything to discuss, please leave a comment in the comment section. And if you are subscribed to this channel, please check your notifications to make sure you are still notified to when I actually post videos. But anyways, I hope everyone out there has a fantastic rest of your week, and until next time.